I shouldn't have spoken that night, but silence felt heavier than fear, like the air itself was waiting for something to break. I was just a waitress trying to survive another 12-hour shift at a place where the lighting was too dim and the suits were too expensive for someone like me to belong, my feet aching. My fingers smelling like espresso and polished glass, pretending not to notice the way conversations lowered when certain people walked in, pretending not to hear things I wasn't supposed to understand. Until the door opened, and everything changed, not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet shift, like gravity had tilted. He stepped inside, Luca Romano, a name I'd only heard in whispers. The kind of man who didn't need attention because attention followed him anyway, and the entire room adjusted without being told, shoulders straightening, voices softening, eyes avoiding his. I felt it too, that invisible line you don't cross, that instinct that says stay small, stay quiet, don't get noticed. So I lowered my gaze and focused on my tray, counting steps, 1, 2, 3, like it could keep me invisible. But then they came in behind him, different energy, sharper, colder, men who didn't belong to the same silence. They spoke in Italian, fast, controlled, like they thought no one else could understand, and for a second, I froze. I did understand. Every word landing too clearly, too dangerously, a conversation that wasn't meant for ears like mine. I told myself to ignore it, to walk away, to be nobody, because nobody stays safe, but my hands tightened around the tray anyway, my heartbeat loud in my ears, because the tone wasn't casual, it wasn't business. It was something else, something final. I risked a glance, just one, and saw Luca standing still, not reacting, not yet. Like he already knew the world was shifting around him, and no one moved to help. No one spoke, the entire room choosing silence over involvement. And that's when I realized something that tightened my chest. He didn't know. Not all of it. Not the part they thought was hidden behind another language. I swallowed hard. Every instinct screaming at me to stay out of it, to keep my head down, to finish my shift and go home to my tiny apartment and forget this night ever happened. But my feet wouldn't move, and the words kept echoing in my mind, sharp and clear, and before I could stop myself. Before I could think it through, I took a breath that didn't feel like mine, and stepped forward into a silence that suddenly felt too loud, knowing the second I opened my mouth, nothing in my life would ever be the same again. The moment the words left my mouth, the world did not explode. It narrowed, like everything that existed pulled into a single point between him and me. My voice was steady in a way I did not recognize. I repeated their sentence in perfect Italian and corrected one small detail they thought they had hidden. The effect was immediate. Not loud, not chaotic, just a shift so sharp it felt like the air had been cut clean. The men who had been speaking went still. Their confidence slipped for 1 second. That second was enough. Luca did not move fast. He did not need to. He just turned his head slightly toward them, then toward me. I felt it, that look, heavy and precise. Like he was reading every decision I had ever made just to understand why I had made this one. My fingers tightened around the tray as I realized what I had done, not just speaking, but choosing a side in a room where sides were never neutral. I wanted to take it back, to pretend it had not happened, to disappear into the background where I belonged. But because it was too late for that, because now everyone was watching, not openly, not obviously. But I could feel it in the way conversations had stopped mid-sentence, in the way the manager suddenly found something else to do across the room, in the way no one stepped closer. No one interrupted, and the silence stretched. Long enough for doubt to creep in. Long enough for me to wonder if I had misunderstood, if I had just made a mistake that would cost me everything. But then Lucas spoke, not to me, not directly, but in the same language they had used. His voice calm, controlled, and unmistakably aware, and whatever he said shifted the balance completely, because the men who had walked in with confidence now hesitated, their posture changing, their eyes flickering in a way that told me they had lost something they had been certain of only moments ago. I realized that information, something as simple as understanding, had just changed the outcome of whatever this was supposed to be. I had been the one to give it to him. My heart pounded so hard it hurt. I knew what that meant. I was no longer invisible, no longer just the girl carrying drinks and clearing tables. I had stepped into something I did not understand, something that did not let people walk away easily. When Luca finally looked at me again, really looked this time, there was nothing accidental in it. No curiosity, No surprise, just recognition. Like he had already decided I mattered in a way I had never intended. And that realization sent a chill through me stronger than fear, because fear fades, but this felt permanent, like a door had opened behind me and quietly closed before I could turn around. I forced myself to breathe, to move, to finish what I had been doing. I placed the glass down on the table with hands that did not quite shake. I told myself that if I acted normal, the night might move past me. Maybe I could still leave when my shift ended and pretend none of this had happened. Deep down, I knew better. The way he watched me now was not something you could ignore. I turned to walk away, hoping distance would make me invisible again. His voice cut through the room, low, controlled, and impossible to mistake. Not loud enough for everyone, but clear enough for me, and only me. Wait. Near the entrance, one of the men who had spoken in Italian adjusted his cuff and smiled as if nothing had happened. But his eyes stayed on me. Another man leaned close to him and murmured a single word I could not hear. Luca heard it. I saw that in the smallest turn of his head. The room pretended not to notice, but everyone noticed. A fork stopped halfway to a plate. A glass hovered near someone's mouth. Even the music seemed thinner. For the first time, danger had a shape, and it was standing only a few tables away, wearing a tailored coat and a patient expression. The single word stopped me mid-step, not loud, not urgent. Absolute, like the kind of command that did not need to be repeated. I felt it in the way my body reacted before my mind could catch up. My fingers tightening around the empty tray. My breath catching somewhere between my chest and my throat. And for a second I considered pretending I had not heard it, pretending I was just another employee too busy to notice, but something in his tone made that impossible. So I turned slowly, carefully, as if any sudden movement might shift whatever fragile balance had just been created. When I faced him again, the room felt different, smaller somehow, like everything outside of this moment had faded into a distant blur. His eyes were on me fully now, not passing, not curious, focused, deliberate. I had never been looked at like that before, not by anyone, not like I was something to be understood instead of ignored, and it made my heartbeat unsteady in a way that had nothing to do with fear alone. I forced myself to hold his gaze for exactly 1 second before looking slightly down, not submissive, just careful. I did not know the rules here, only that they existed and I was already breaking them. He stepped closer, not rushed, not aggressive. Just a shift in distance that made everything feel more personal than it should have been. Close enough that I could catch the faint scent of something expensive, clean, controlled, like everything about him. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, meant only for me. Where did you learn that? The question simple, but layered so it made it clear he was not just asking about language. He was asking about me, about something I had tried very hard not to be noticed for years. I swallowed, my mind racing through every possible answer, every possible consequence, because the truth was not simple, and the wrong answer felt dangerous in ways I could not explain. School, I said finally, the word sounding thinner than I intended. I knew immediately it was not enough. His gaze did not shift, did not soften. If anything, it sharpened slightly, like he was measuring the space between what I said and what I meant. I felt exposed in a way I had not felt in years, like he could see past the uniform, past the practice smiles and quiet routine, straight into the parts of me I kept hidden. I looked away first, not out of weakness, but because holding that gaze felt like standing too close to something powerful and unpredictable. That was not just school, he said, not accusing, just certain, and the calm in his voice made it harder to argue. He was not trying to prove me wrong. He already believed he was right. I hesitated, the truth pressing at the edge of my throat. Memories I did not revisit, words I had not spoken out loud in years, and for a second I almost told him, almost let that part of my past slip into the open, but instinct pulled me back, reminding me why I kept it hidden in the first place. It was enough, I answered instead, quieter now, but steady, and his expression shifted, not disappointment, not frustration, just a subtle acknowledgement. Like he understood more than I had said and was choosing, for now, not to push further, and that choice unsettled me more than any demand could have. It meant he was patient, and patient people did not forget. His eyes held mine for 1 more second, long enough to make sure I understood that this conversation was not finished, not even close. Before he stepped back slightly, creating just enough space for me to breathe again, but not enough to feel free. When he spoke next, the words were simple, almost casual, but because they carried weight in a way I could not ignore. "You should not have spoken," he said, and for a brief moment, my stomach dropped. I thought I had made a mistake I could not fix. But then he added, just as quietly, "But I am glad you did." And that was the moment I realized this was not over, not when my shift ended, not when I walked out of this building. Whatever I had stepped into was still unfolding. He was already a part of it, whether I wanted him to be or not. I told myself to walk away after that, to nod, to return to my tables, to become invisible again like I had been for the past 3 years, but my feet did not move right away, and neither did his, and the space between us felt suspended. Like something unfinished was still hanging there, waiting. The kind of moment you could either escape or step deeper into. I hated that part of me that hesitated, that stayed just 1 second longer than necessary, because that second felt like a choice. Even if I had not meant it to be, he watched me carefully, not impatient, not demanding, just present, so it made everything else feel distant, like the noise of the restaurant had faded into something dull and unimportant. I forced myself to break eye contact first, turning slightly, adjusting the empty glasses on my tray even though they did not need adjusting, just to give my hands something to do, something normal, because normal was the only thing keeping me grounded. "I should get back to work," I said, my voice steady enough to pass, but not strong enough to feel convincing, and for a second I wondered if he would stop me again, if he would say a truth that would pull me further into whatever this was. But because he did not immediately, and that silence felt heavier than if he had. It meant he was deciding something, not reacting. When he finally stepped back, just enough to clear my path, it did not feel like permission, it felt like allowance. Like he was letting me go for now. Not because I was free, but because he chose not to hold me there, and that difference settled uneasily in my chest as I walked away, each step measured, controlled, resisting the urge to look back even though I could feel his gaze on me, following, not in a way that chased, but in a way that marked. I returned to my section, picking up an order pad, refilling a glass, answering a question from a customer that I did not fully hear. My mind still caught in that moment, replaying every word, every glance, trying to understand what had just happened and why it felt like more than it should have been, because logically, it was just a conversation, just a question, just a mistake I could pretend never happened, but nothing about it felt small. I noticed things I had not noticed before. The way the other staff avoided looking at me directly. The way my manager watched from across the room with a tight expression before quickly turning away when I met his eyes. Like he did not want to be associated with whatever had just unfolded, and that told me more than the words themselves, because people like him only avoided things that mattered. I swallowed, forcing myself to focus on the routine, on the rhythm of service, because that was safe, predictable, something I understood, but the sense of being watched did not fade. It stayed, subtle but constant, like a shadow just out of reach, and every time I moved, every time I spoke, I felt aware of it, aware of him, and it made it harder to breathe normally, harder to pretend this was just another shift. Minutes passed, maybe more. Time felt strange, stretched, and uneven. I almost convinced myself that it was over, that whatever interest he had would fade as quickly as it had appeared, that I would finish my shift, clock out, and return to a life where no one looked at me twice. But then I heard my name, not shouted, not announced, just spoken quietly by someone beside me, one of the senior servers who rarely spoke more than necessary. I turned to her, confused, until she nodded slightly toward the back of the restaurant, toward the private section we were not usually allowed near, and said, "He asked for you." And the words landed heavier than they should have, simple, direct, impossible to misunderstand, and for a moment I just stood there, the tray in my hands suddenly feeling heavier than before. I knew, without needing to ask, exactly who she meant. In that moment, walking away was no longer something I could pretend to choose. My manager intercepted me near the service station before I could reach the private section. His smile was fixed too tightly to be kind. "Whatever he wants, you answer and you come back," he whispered. "Do not make this restaurant part of your problem." The warning stung because it sounded practical, almost reasonable, but his hands were shaking when he straightened the stack of menus. That was when I understood he was not protecting me. He was protecting himself. I looked past him toward the darkened corridor and felt the choice narrow again. No one was going to stand beside me. If I walked in there, I walked in alone. Two men stood outside the private room when I arrived. They did not block the door, yet the hallway felt blocked all the same. One glanced at my empty tray, then at my face, weighing whether a waitress could be a threat. The other opened the door without a word. Warm light spilled across the carpet. Inside, Luca had not moved, but the table around him had changed. A phone lay face down beside his glass. A folded napkin had been torn once down the center, clean and deliberate. It looked small. It did not feel small. It felt like proof that while I had been trying to breathe, decisions had already begun moving around me. I stood there for a second too long, the noise of the restaurant fading into a distant blur again as those 3 words settled in my chest. He asked for you. Simple, direct, but heavier than anything that had happened all night. I felt that same pull I had felt earlier, that invisible shift that told me this was not optional. Not really. Even if it sounded like a request, my grip tightened on the tray as I nodded once, more to myself than to her, and turned toward the private section, each step slower than the last. Not because I was afraid to go, but I knew once I did. There was no pretending this was just a coincidence anymore. The soft carpet under my shoes muted my steps as I crossed the threshold into a part of the restaurant that always felt slightly out of reach, the lighting lower, the air quieter, conversations more controlled. He was there, exactly where I knew he would be, seated like nothing around him had ever been uncertain, like the entire night had unfolded exactly as expected, his posture relaxed but deliberate, one hand resting near a glass he had barely touched, the other draped casually along the back of his chair. When I approached, he did not look up immediately, which somehow made it harder. It meant he was aware of me without needing to show it. I stopped a few feet away, close enough to be seen, far enough to still feel like I had a choice, even if I knew I did not. You asked for me, I said, keeping my voice level, professional, the same tone I used with every customer, even though nothing about this felt the same. And that was when he looked up, slow, deliberate. His eyes meeting mine with that same intensity that made it hard to breathe normally. Like he was not just looking at me, but through me, past everything I chose to show. I did, he said. His voice calm, measured, like he had all the time in the world. I felt that again, that quiet certainty in the way he spoke, like nothing here moved without his awareness. I forced myself to stand still, to not fidget, to not give away the way my thoughts were racing. I did not know what he wanted yet, and not knowing felt more dangerous than anything else. Sit, he added after a brief pause, the words soft, almost polite, but unmistakably an instruction, and for a second I hesitated. Not because I wanted to refuse, but because sitting meant staying, meant stepping further into this conversation than I had planned, but every instinct told me refusing would not create distance, it would only draw more attention. So I moved, slowly lowering myself into the chair across from him, placing the tray carefully on the table like it was something fragile, a mistake that could break if I handled it wrong. And the moment I sat down, the space between us felt different, smaller, more personal than before. I became aware of every detail, the faint hum of the air conditioning, the distant clink of glassware, the steady rhythm of my own heartbeat. You understand more than you say, he began, not a question. Not even an accusation, just a statement delivered with quiet certainty. I felt my stomach tighten slightly, because there it was again, that sense that he was already ahead of me, already piecing together things I had not offered. I considered denying it, giving him the same surface-level answer I had before, but something about the way he watched me made that feel pointless, like trying to hide behind something transparent. I understand enough. I replied instead, careful, measured, choosing each word like it mattered. It did. He studied me for a moment, not rushing, not pushing, just observing in a way that felt more intentional than anything I was used to. Then he leaned back slightly, creating just enough space to make it seem less intense, even though it was not really. That kind of understanding, he said slowly, does not come from nowhere, and I knew what he was asking without him needing to say it directly, not just about the language, but about everything behind it. Every piece of my past I had kept quiet, every reason I had chosen this life where no one asked questions, and for a second I thought about telling him, about letting the truth sit between us instead of this careful distance, but the instinct to protect it was stronger, it always had been. It was a long time ago, I said finally. My voice quieter now, but steady, and his expression shifted again, not frustration, not disappointment, just recognition. Like he understood that pushing further right now would not give him more, only resistance. And that realization unsettled me more than the words themselves. It meant this was not a conversation he intended to finish tonight, and as that thought settled in, I realized something that tightened my chest. This was only the beginning. He already knew it. For a moment neither of us spoke, and the silence between us did not feel empty. It felt deliberate, like something being built piece by piece without either of us needing to rush it. I realized then that this was not how conversations usually went for me. Not here, not anywhere. People either ignored me or spoke over me. But because he did neither, he watched, he waited, and somehow that made it harder to stay guarded, because patience like that meant he was not just interested in what I said. He was interested in what I chose not to say. I shifted slightly in my seat, aware of how still I had been, how carefully I had been holding myself together. You listen more than most people in this room, he said after a while, his tone quieter now, less about control and more like an observation he had already confirmed. I exhaled slowly, because that was not a question I could deflect easily. It is part of the job, I replied, keeping my voice neutral. But because he shook his head once, subtle, almost imperceptible, no, he said, that is not what I mean. And his tone made something tighten in my chest again. He was not letting me stay on the surface, not letting me hide behind routine. I looked down at my hands for a second, at the faint line where the tray had pressed into my palm, grounding myself in a simple thing, a physical anchor. Before looking back at him, "Then what do you mean?" I asked, and it was the first time I had asked him something directly, not reacting, not answering, but stepping into the conversation in a way I had been avoiding. I felt the shift immediately, small but undeniable, because his gaze changed slightly, not softer, but more focused. Like he had been waiting for that. "I mean, you knew when to speak," he said, "and more importantly, when not to." And I did not have an answer for that, not a safe one, because the truth was not something I could explain in a sentence. It was years of learning, of adapting, of surviving in spaces where saying the wrong thing mattered, where silence was sometimes the only protection you had. I felt those memories brush the edge of my thoughts again, the ones I kept buried, the ones I had decided were better left in the past. And for a second I almost said it, almost told him that it was not instinct. It was practice, learned the hard way. But I stopped myself, because saying that would open a door I was not ready to walk through. Not with him, not here. So instead I gave him the only truth I could offer without giving everything away. "Sometimes staying quiet is easier," I said. He watched me for a moment, long enough that I wondered if he would challenge it, if he would push further the way he had before. But because he did not this time. Instead he leaned back slightly, his expression thoughtful, so it made it clear he was processing more than just my words, and that unsettled me again. It meant this was not ending here, not in this conversation, not tonight. "Easier does not mean better," he said finally, and the simplicity of it caught me off guard. It was not a warning, not a correction, just a statement that felt heavier than it should have. I felt something shift inside me at that, a small detail but real, because part of me knew he was right, even if I had spent years convincing myself otherwise. I looked away again, not because I was avoiding him, but I needed a second to think, to breathe, to remind myself where I was and what this was supposed to be, just a job, just a night, just a conversation that would end when I stood up and walked away. But the longer I sat there, the less that felt true. I realized a detail that made my pulse pick up again. This was not about the language anymore, not really. It was about me, about the parts of me I had tried to keep invisible. He had noticed them anyway, without me wanting him to, without me inviting it. And that realization felt more dangerous than anything that had happened earlier. It meant I was not as hidden as I thought I was. When I finally looked back at him, I knew from the way his gaze held steady that he had reached the same conclusion, and that whatever came next would not be something I could simply walk away from, not anymore. The longer I sat there, the more I understood that leaving would not reset anything. It would not rewind the moment or erase the fact that he had seen me in a way no one else had. And that realization settled slowly, like something heavy finding its place. I straightened slightly in my chair, not to challenge him, but to remind myself that I still had control over how I carried myself, even if I did not have control over how this situation unfolded. "You are very quiet now," he said, and there was something different in his tone, not sharper, not colder, just more aware. Like he had noticed the shift in me the same way I had noticed everything about him. I let out a small breath before answering. "I am thinking," and it was the most honest thing I had said since I sat down. I was thinking about how to navigate this without losing myself, how to respond without giving away too much, how to stay grounded when everything around me felt slightly off balance. He nodded once, like that answer made sense to him, like thinking was something he respected, and for a moment the tension eased, not gone, but quieter, like a pause instead of a stop. "Good," he said. "Most people speak before they understand," and I almost smiled at that. Not because it was funny, but because it felt true in a way that was oddly reassuring, like for the first time that night. I was not completely out of place, and that thought caught me off guard. I had spent so long making sure I stayed in the background, making sure I did not stand out, and yet here I was, sitting across from him, being seen in a way I had not planned for, and not entirely hating it, which unsettled me more than the words themselves. It meant something inside me was responding to this, not just reacting, and that was dangerous in a different way. "Why me?" I asked before I could stop myself, the question slipping out quieter than I intended, but clear enough, and the moment it left my mouth I felt a flicker of hesitation. I had crossed another line, from answering to asking, from reacting to engaging. I did not know how he would take that, but because he did not seem surprised, if anything. There was a brief shift in his expression, something that looked almost like approval. "Because you did not look away," he said, and the answer was immediate. Like he had already decided that. I frowned slightly, not in disagreement, but in confusion. "Other people noticed too," I said, thinking back to the room. The way conversations had paused, the way attention had shifted. He shook his head again, subtle but certain. "They noticed," he said, "but because they chose not to see," and that distinction lingered. It was not about awareness. It was about choice, about deciding whether to stay passive or step forward. I felt that moment replay in my mind again, the second before I spoke, the choice I had made without fully understanding it, and for the first time I saw it from his perspective, not as a mistake, but as something intentional, something that had meaning beyond the moment, and that realization tightened my chest slightly. It meant he was not just responding to what I did. He was interpreting it, giving it weight I had not considered, and now, he continued, his voice steady, "You are part of it." And the words were simple, but because they landed heavier than anything else he had said, they confirmed what I had been trying not to admit since this started, that this was not separate from me anymore, not something I could walk away from and forget. I held his gaze for a second longer this time, not out of defiance, but I needed to understand what that meant, what being part of it actually involved. But before I could ask, before I could form the words, someone approached the table, quiet, respectful, and leaned slightly toward him, speaking just low enough that I could not catch everything. But I heard enough, a few words, a name, a location, something that shifted his attention instantly, not away from me completely, but enough to remind me that whatever this was, it existed within a much larger world, one I had only just stepped into. When he looked back at me, there was a subtle change, not distance, but focus redirected. Like something else now required his attention, and that should have been my moment to stand, to leave, to step back into the safety of the familiar. But I stayed exactly where I was, because something told me this conversation was not finished yet, not even close. I was already too far in to pretend otherwise. I watched the shift happen in real time, subtle but undeniable. The way his attention moved without losing its precision. Like he was balancing two worlds at once, the one in front of him and the one beyond this room. And it reminded me again that whatever I had stepped into was larger than this table, larger than this conversation, something structured, controlled, and constantly in motion. I felt out of place in a way I had not allowed myself to fully acknowledge until now. Not because I did not belong here physically, but I did not understand the rules that guided everything beneath the surface. The man beside him finished speaking and stepped back, quiet, efficient, like he had said exactly what needed to be said and nothing more. And Luca did not respond immediately. He just gave a small nod, a signal that felt final without needing explanation. Then his attention returned to me completely, as if the interruption had not happened at all, as if I was still the most important thing in front of him. And that should not have mattered. It should not have felt significant, but because it did. It meant he chose to come back to this, to me, even with everything else demanding his focus. You should go back, he said, and for a second I thought that was it, that this was where it ended, a simple dismissal wrapped in something polite, and part of me almost felt relief at that. It meant I could stand, walk away, return to something familiar, but there was something in his tone that stopped me from moving right away, not an order, not a command, just a suggestion that carried an unspoken layer beneath it. Like he was testing whether I would leave or stay. I realized then that this was another choice, another moment where what I did next mattered more than it seemed. I stayed, just long enough for that decision to become clear, my hands resting lightly on the edge of the table, my posture steady, not defiant, just intentional, and his gaze sharpened slightly in response, not surprised, but acknowledging. Like he had expected that outcome. You do not follow directions easily, he observed, and there was something almost amused in his tone, not mocking, not critical, just noting a fact. I let out a small breath, not quite a laugh, but close enough. I do. I replied quietly, when they make sense, and for the first time since I had sat down. There was a pause that felt different, not tense, not heavy, but balanced, like the space between us had shifted into something more equal, even if only slightly. I saw it in the way his expression changed, subtle, controlled, but there, like he had just learned something new about me, something that fit into whatever picture he was building in his mind, and that thought unsettled me again. I did not know what that picture was, or what he intended to do with it. Most people do not question what they are told, he said. I shook my head slightly. Most people are not paying attention. I answered, the words leaving me before I could soften them, and for a second I wondered if I had gone too far, if I had crossed a line I did not see. But because he did not react the way I expected, there was no irritation, no correction, just a quiet stillness. Like he was considering the weight of that answer. Then he nodded once, slowly, like he agreed more than he disagreed, and that was when I realized something that tightened my chest again. This was no longer only a conversation. It was an exchange, something shifting back and forth between us, each word changing the dynamic in ways I did not fully understand, and that made it harder to stay detached, harder to treat this like something temporary. You are different from the others here, he said after a moment, and the statement was simple, but because it carried a deeper truth, a pressure that felt less like observation and more like conclusion. I looked away briefly, not because I disagreed, but I did not want to be defined by that, not here, not by him. I am just doing my job, I said, returning to the one thing I could control, the one role that kept everything simple. But when I looked back at him, I knew from the way he held my gaze that he did not believe that for a second, and more importantly, he was not going to let me believe it either. In that moment, I understood something clearly for the first time. This was not about what I had done earlier, not really. It was about what I represented now, something he had noticed, something he had decided mattered, and that realization settled deep. It meant this connection, whatever it was not accidental, and it was not a truth that would fade when I walked away, and as that thought took hold, he leaned slightly forward, just enough to close the distance again. His voice quieter now, more focused than before. Tell me one true thing, he said, and the request was simple, but the weight behind it was not. I knew he was not asking for a safe answer, not this time, and for the first time tonight. I was not sure if I had one to give. I could feel the weight of that request settle between us. Simple words, tell me one true thing, but nothing about it felt simple, not here, not with him, because truth was never just truth. It was exposure. It was choice. It was deciding what part of myself I was willing to let exist outside my own control, and for a second I said nothing. My fingers pressing lightly against the edge of the table as I searched for a safe answer, a small detail enough to give without opening everything else. But his gaze did not shift, did not soften. It stayed steady, patient. Like he already knew I would answer, like silence was just part of the process, not an escape from it. I exhaled slowly, feeling the tension in my chest ease just enough to speak. I did not plan to say anything tonight, I said finally. My voice quiet but clear, and it felt strange to admit that out loud, like acknowledging the moment made it more real, more permanent. He watched me closely, not interrupting, not reacting, just listening, so it made it easier and harder at the same time. Easier, he was not forcing anything out of me. Harder, it made me want to keep going. I was going to finish my shift, go home, and forget this place existed. I added, and there was a small pause after that. The kind that let the words settle. The kind that made me aware of how much I had just revealed without saying anything specific, and his expression shifted slightly, not in surprise, but in understanding. Like he recognized that instinct, that need to stay separate from something bigger than yourself. But you did not, he said. I shook my head once, a small movement that carried more weight than it should have. No, I replied, and for a moment that was enough. That simple exchange, truth met with acknowledgement. But I could feel it. The way the conversation was still moving, still pulling forward. I knew if I stopped there, it would feel incomplete. Like I had only answered part of what he asked, and something in me did not want to do that. Not anymore. Not after everything that had already shifted tonight. So I took another breath, slower this time, steadier, and added, I spoke, it felt wrong not to. And the moment I said it, I felt something settle inside me, something that had been uncertain before. Like I had finally put a shape to the choice I made. And his eyes held mine a fraction longer, sharper now, more focused, like that answer mattered more than the words themselves I had said. Wrong, he repeated, and there was something in his tone, not questioning, not dismissing, just testing the weight of it. I nodded slightly. Yes, I said, like staying quiet would have been easier, but not right. And the words felt heavier as they left me. They were not just about that moment. They were about a deeper truth, something I had been carrying long before tonight, something I had not spoken out loud in years. I realized too late that I had given him more than I intended, not details, not facts, but a more important truth, a glimpse into how I thought, how I decided. And that kind of truth was harder to take back. And for a second, I braced myself for a reaction, for him to push further, to ask more, to follow that thread into places I was not ready to go. But because he did not immediately, instead he leaned back slightly, studying me in a way that felt quieter now, less about control and more about understanding, and that shift unsettled me again. It meant he was not just collecting information. He was interpreting it, placing it into something larger, something I could not see. I realized then that answering him had not closed anything. It had opened something else entirely, a truth that would not end when I stood up and walked away. And as that thought settled, he spoke again. His voice lower, more certain than before. That is not a small reason, he said, and his tone made it clear he was not dismissing it, not reducing it to a simple thing. And for the first time since this conversation began, I felt something shift that was not tension, not uncertainty, but a quiet certainty, closer to being understood, and that feeling was unfamiliar enough to make me uneasy, because understanding meant connection, and connection meant risk. I was not sure I was ready for either, especially not here, especially not with him, and yet I stayed exactly where I was, knowing that whatever came next, I had already crossed the line that mattered most. When he asked for truth, I almost gave him the harmless version. I almost told him I had learned Italian from old textbooks and late nights, from songs on the radio, from wanting a life bigger than the one I had. Some of that was even true, but because it was not the truth that mattered. The truth that mattered had my father's voice in it, low and urgent, teaching me which words people used when they wanted to sound harmless. It had my mother closing curtains before she cried. It had the sound of a car idling outside our building for 3 nights in a row. I had not run from languages. I had run from what people hid inside them. His words did not fade when he said them. They stayed, settling somewhere deeper than I expected. I realized that what unsettled me was not what he understood. It was that he did not dismiss it. He did not reduce it into something convenient or simple. He treated it like it mattered. I was not used to that, not in a place like this, not from someone like him. And for a moment, I did not know how to respond, because there was no script for this. No role I could fall back into that would make this easier to navigate. So I stayed quiet, letting the silence stretch just enough to think, just enough to steady myself again. He did not rush me. He never did. That patience again, constant, deliberate, like he was always one step ahead, but never forcing the pace, and it made me more aware of every second, every choice, every word that came next. You see things differently, he said after a while. not as a question, but as something he had already decided. I tilted my head slightly, considering that. It was not wrong, but because it was not something I usually allowed myself to acknowledge either. I see what is in front of me, I answered, careful, neutral. But because he shook his head once, subtle, certain, no, he said quietly. You see what is underneath it. And his tone tightened my chest again, because that was closer to the truth than I wanted it to be, closer than I had let anyone get in a long time. I looked away for a brief second, not to hide, but to give myself space to breathe, to keep that part of me from being fully exposed, because once something like that is seen, it cannot be unseen. I was not sure I was ready for that. Not with him, not here, but when I looked back, his gaze had not changed, still steady, still focused, still waiting. I realized he was not going to let this go. Not because he wanted to control the conversation, but because he had already chosen to understand it, and that made it harder to stay closed off, harder to retreat into something safe and distant. Sometimes, I admitted, the word quiet but real, and it felt like a small step. But I knew it was not. It was the first time I had not tried to redirect or minimize what he saw, and the air shifted again, subtle but present, like the space between us had adjusted in response. He leaned forward just slightly, not enough to close the distance completely, but enough to signal that this mattered, that what I had just said was something he was paying attention to. That is why you spoke, he said, connecting the pieces without needing me to confirm it. I hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding, because denying it now would feel pointless, and more importantly, untrue, and something about this moment made it harder to choose anything but honesty, even if it was limited, even if it was controlled. Yes, I said, and the word felt heavier than it should have. It carried everything behind it, every reason I had not explained, every instinct I had followed without fully understanding. He watched me for a second longer, like he was making sure that answer was solid, like he was testing whether it would shift or hold. When it did not, when I did not look away or try to soften it, his expression changed again, not visibly, not in a way most people would notice. But I did, a slight ease, a subtle acknowledgement, like he had just confirmed an important detail, something that fit into whatever he had been building in his mind since the moment I spoke earlier, and that realization made my pulse pick up again. I did not know what that meant for me, what role I had just stepped into without meaning to, and before I could ask, before I could decide whether I even wanted to know, he spoke again. His voice quieter now, more focused than before. Do you always choose what is right? He asked, and this time it was a question, direct, deliberate, and it caught me off guard. It was not about the moment anymore. It was about me, about something broader, something I had never been asked so plainly. I let out a small breath, almost a quiet laugh. Not because it was funny, but because the answer was not simple, not clean, not something I could give without thinking. No, I said after a second, honest in a way that surprised even me, and his gaze sharpened slightly, not in judgment, but in interest, like that answer told him more than anything else I could have said. I continued, quieter now. I choose what I can live with, and the moment I said it, I knew that was the truth he had been asking for, not perfection, not ideals, but a grounded truth, and the silence that followed felt different again, not tense, not uncertain, but settled. Like something had been clarified between us without needing further explanation, and as I held his gaze, I realized that whatever this was, whatever had started tonight, it was no longer just about a single decision. It was about understanding who I was in a way I had spent years avoiding, and somehow, without meaning to, I had let him see it. His words lingered longer than they should have, not because they were complicated, but because they were clear, and clarity has a way of removing all the places you usually hide. I could feel that now, sitting across from him, knowing that whatever I had just said had settled into weight between us, something that neither of us could ignore anymore. And for a moment neither of us spoke, the silence stretching again, but this time it felt different, less uncertain, more defined. Like something had shifted into place. I became aware of the space around us again, the low hum of the restaurant returning slowly, the distant sound of glass against wood, muted conversations blending into the background, but none of it felt as close as it had before. Like I was sitting slightly outside of it now. I realized that was because of him, because of this moment, because of the way everything had narrowed and then expanded again in a way I could not quite explain. I let out a slow breath, steadying myself, grounding myself in a familiar anchor. I needed that. Needed to remember that this was still a place I worked, still a night that would end, even if it no longer felt simple. "You are honest," he said finally. His voice quiet but certain. I glanced up at him, a little surprised by the statement. It did not feel like honesty, not fully. It felt controlled, measured, partial. I shook my head slightly. "Not always," I replied. He held my gaze for a second, like he was weighing that answer, then nodded once. "But when it matters," he said, and there it was again, that ability to take something I had tried to minimize and return it with more weight than I intended. I felt a small shift inside me at that, something I could not quite name, not agreement exactly, but recognition. Like he was seeing a pattern I had never put into words, and that unsettled me in a quieter way than before. It meant this was no longer only about tonight. It was about a deeper truth, something that had existed long before this moment. And for a second, I wondered what he saw when he looked at me. Not the uniform, not the role, but the person underneath it, the one I kept carefully out of view, and the thought tightened my chest slightly, because being seen like that was not something I was used to, not something I knew how to handle. I shifted my hands again, lightly tracing the edge of the table just to give myself something steady, a real weight. "Why does it matter to you?" I asked quietly, and this time I did not hesitate, did not try to soften the question. I needed to understand this part, needed to know why he was still here, why he had not ended this conversation already, why I was still sitting across from him instead of returning to something simple and predictable. He did not answer immediately, which told me the question mattered. Not because it was difficult, but because he was choosing how to respond. When he did speak, his voice was lower, more deliberate. "Because people like you do not appear by accident," he said, and the words settled slowly, heavier than I expected. I felt that familiar tension return, because that was not something I could dismiss easily, not something I could pretend was just observation. It felt like a conclusion, something he had already decided. I frowned slightly, not in disagreement, but in uncertainty. "People like me." I repeated, the phrase unfamiliar, almost strange. He nodded once. "People who see, who choose, who act when it would be easier not to," he clarified. I looked down for a brief moment, processing that, because hearing it said out loud made it feel larger than it should have. Like something I had treated as small was suddenly being framed as significant. I was not sure I was comfortable with that. Not yet. I let out a small breath before looking back at him. "It does not feel like that," I admitted, and that was the truth, because from where I sat, it had felt like one moment, one decision, not something that defined anything beyond tonight. And his expression did not change much, but there was a slight shift, a quiet certainty, more certain. "It will," he said, and the confidence in that statement made my pulse pick up again. Not because it was threatening, but because it felt inevitable for reasons I could not explain. Like he was not predicting something. He was recognizing it. I felt that same sense of something moving forward, something I could not stop or step away from easily anymore. And for a second I considered standing, ending this, returning to the part of my life where none of this existed, but the thought did not feel real anymore. Not after everything that had already changed. I stayed where I was, meeting his gaze again, knowing that whatever came next, it would not be something I could pretend did not matter. In that moment, I understood that this was no longer only a conversation. It was a turning point, even if I did not yet know what it was turning into. Outside the private section, a burst of laughter rose from the dining room and died too quickly. Luca's gaze flicked toward the sound. Mine followed. Through the narrow gap in the curtain, I saw the man from the entrance watching us through the reflection in a window. He was not smiling now. The sight turned every quiet word between Luca and me into a risk. This was no longer a strange conversation with a dangerous man. It was a line being drawn in public, thin enough for others to deny, clear enough for everyone involved to understand. If I stepped back, they would remember me anyway. If I stayed, I would have to become braver than I felt. For a moment I thought about what he said, not just the words, but the certainty behind them. The way he spoke as if something had already been decided, as if whatever I thought this was, it was already becoming something else entirely. I felt that tension again, not fear exactly, but awareness. The kind that settles in your chest when you realize a moment is not temporary anymore, that it has already begun to stretch into something you cannot fully control. I leaned back slightly in my chair. Just enough to create space. Just enough to remind myself that I was still here by choice. Even if that choice felt smaller than before. You talk like this is already decided, I said quietly, and my voice held more steadiness than I expected, because part of me needed to push back, needed to understand where the line was, if there was one at all. He watched me for a second, his expression unreadable in that calm way that never gave too much away. It is not decided, he said, and there was a pause after that, just long enough to make the next words land differently. But because it is moving, and something about that felt more real than anything else he had said, not fixed, not controlled, but in motion. Like something had already started and neither of us was pretending otherwise. I let out a slow breath, my fingers tracing the edge of the table again, grounding myself in a simple thing, a familiar anchor, because everything else felt slightly out of place. I realized then that I had been trying to understand this from the wrong perspective. I had been thinking about how to step out of it, how to return to something unchanged, but that was no longer an option, not really. Not after everything that had already shifted. I looked at him again, more directly this time, less guarded. Not because I trusted him, but because avoiding the moment no longer made sense. And what does that mean for me? I asked, and this time there was no hesitation, no attempt to soften the question, because if I was already part of this, I needed to understand what that actually involved. He did not answer right away. Not because he did not have an answer, but because he was choosing how to give it. I could see that in the way his gaze held steady, in the way his posture did not change, controlled, deliberate, like everything about him. It means you will have to decide what you want this to be, he said finally, and the answer was not what I expected, not a command, not a direction, but something that shifted the focus back to me, and that caught me off guard more than the words themselves. I had been preparing for something else, something more defined, a truth that would tell me where I stood, but instead he gave me a choice, and that felt heavier than any instruction could have, because choices come with responsibility, with consequence, with ownership. I felt that settle slowly, deeper than I wanted it to. It meant this was no longer only happening to me. I was part of it, actively, whether I wanted to be or not. I looked down for a moment, processing that, feeling the weight of it, the uncertainty, the possibility, and the risk, all layered together so it made it hard to separate one from the other. I did not choose any of this, I said quietly, more to myself than to him. And there was something honest in that, something raw. It was true. I had not planned for this, had not expected it, had not wanted it. But his response came without hesitation, steady and certain. You chose to speak, he said, and the simplicity of it cut through everything else. He was right. That moment, that single decision, had been mine. No one had forced it. No one had asked for it. I had stepped into it on my own, and that realization settled so it made it impossible to ignore. It meant this was no longer only something that happened. It was something I had started, even if I had not understood it at the time. I felt that truth sit there between us, undeniable, shaping everything that came after, and for a second I did not know what to say, because there was no easy way to respond to that, no simple way to step back from it. When I looked at him again, I saw his expression that I had not seen before, not control, not calculation, just something quieter, closer to expectation, like he was waiting to see what I would do with that realization, and that was when I understood something clearly. This was not about him deciding anything for me. It was about whether I would step forward or pull away, and for the first time tonight. I realized that both options were still possible, but neither of them would leave me unchanged, and as that thought settled, I felt the moment stretch again, not ending, not resolving, just continuing forward, like something had already begun to take shape, and whether I wanted it or not, I was already part of what came next. I slipped the card into my apron without looking at it again. That small movement felt louder than it should have. Across the room, the man in the tailored coat saw it. His smile returned, but because it was thinner now, sharpened at the edges. My manager saw it too and immediately looked away. That was the part that scared me most. Not Luca, not the card. The look on my manager's face told me the restaurant had already chosen its side, and it was not mine. For the rest of the shift, every ordinary sound became suspicious. The printer coughing out orders, the bell from the kitchen, a chair scraping behind me. Each one made me wonder whether someone was coming to ask what I had heard, or whether they already knew enough. By the time I reached the sidewalk, I could still feel the hard corner of the card against my palm. I wanted to throw it into the gutter. I wanted to keep it forever. Both impulses frightened me. A black car rolled past the restaurant without slowing. Then another. Neither stopped, but I waited until their tail lights disappeared before I breathed properly. The city had not changed. The street signs, the closed shops, the wet shine on the pavement, all of it looked exactly the same. Only I felt different, as if a hidden door had opened somewhere inside the life I thought I understood. When I finally stood to leave, Luca did not reach for me, and that restraint unsettled me more than a command would have. He only said my name once. I had not told it to him. Not directly. The sound of it in his mouth was calm, almost careful, but because it landed like a warning and a promise at the same time. I turned back before I meant to. He slid a small black card across the table with 2 fingers. No logo. No address. Only a number pressed into the paper in silver. If they come to you before I do, he said, do not be brave. Be fast. The truth lingered between us longer than anything else we had said that night. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was undeniable. I could feel the weight of it settling into a truth that would not disappear once I stood up and walked away. And for the first time since this began, I stopped trying to find an exit, stopped looking for a way to return to who I had been before I spoke, because something in me understood that version of the night was already gone, replaced by a quiet certainty, but far more permanent. I let out a slow breath, steadying myself not against him, but against the realization itself, because this was not about him pulling me into his world. It was about me stepping into it, even if I had not meant to, and that difference mattered more than I wanted it to. Then I already made the first choice, I said quietly, more certain now. He watched me with that same steady focus, not interrupting, not correcting, just letting the words exist as they were. When I met his gaze again, I did not look away this time, not immediately, because something had shifted inside me, something that no longer needed to hide quite as much as before. Yes, he said after a moment, and the simplicity of it felt like confirmation rather than agreement. Like something had been acknowledged instead of decided, and the silence that followed did not feel heavy anymore. It felt defined, like the space between us had settled into something neither of us was trying to avoid. I became aware of everything again. The faint glow of the lights reflecting off the table, the distant movement of staff returning to their routines, the quiet hum of a place continuing as if nothing had changed, even though everything had, at least for me. I pushed my chair back slightly, not abruptly, just enough to signal that this moment, this part of it, was reaching its end, even if the rest of it was not. I should go back, I said, and this time it was not an excuse, not an attempt to escape, just a statement of what came next. He did not stop me, not with a word, not with a gesture, and that absence felt intentional, like he was allowing the moment to end without forcing it to continue. I stood slowly, picking up the tray I had set aside earlier, grounding myself again in a familiar anchor, a small thing that still belonged to me, and for a second I hesitated. Not because I was unsure, but I understood that walking away now did not mean leaving this behind. It meant carrying it forward, into whatever came next. I looked at him one last time, not searching for permission, not waiting for direction, just acknowledging what had passed between us, and in that brief moment, I saw his expression that I had not seen before, not control, not calculation, just something quieter. It looked a lot like certainty, and it stayed with me longer than anything else as I turned and walked away, my steps steady even though my thoughts were not, returning to the rhythm of the restaurant, to the familiar motions that now felt slightly different, like they belonged to a version of me that had already shifted, and no one said anything as I passed. No one asked questions, but I could feel it, the subtle awareness. The way the space around me had changed, like something invisible had marked me in a way others could sense without understanding. I moved through it anyway, finishing the last part of my shift on instinct alone.